At 30,000 feet in the air, passengers screamed as turbulence rocked the plane like a toy in the wind. The captain's voice went silent, the cabin lights flickered, and hope seemed to vanish in the chaos. But just as despair gripped everyone on board, a voice broke through the storm. A man they had dismissed earlier, a black pilot traveling as a passenger, who stepped forward when no one else could. What he did next not only saved the flight, but silenced every doubt they had about him forever. The airport was alive with its usual chaos, rolling suitcases clattering over tiled floors, announcements crackling overhead, hurried footsteps blending with the scent of coffee and jet fuel. Families clung to each other, business travelers barked into phones, and children pressed their faces against windows, marveling at the giant planes waiting on the tarmac. Among the sea of travelers stood David Carter, a tall, composed black man in his mid-40s, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone who knew both discipline and hardship. His sharp eyes scanned the departure board as he adjusted the strap of his leather bag. To anyone watching closely, there was something different about him. He didn't move with the uncertainty of most passengers. His walk was steady, calculated, almost as if he knew the rhythm of airports better than anyone else. David wasn't just any traveler. He was a commercial pilot, a veteran of the skies with thousands of hours logged. But today he wasn't in uniform. He wasn't scheduled to fly. He was just another passenger, booked on a domestic flight from Karachi to Islamabad, traveling quietly after visiting family. Out of uniform, most would never know his experience, and David preferred it that way. As he reached the gate, he noticed the crowd gathered. The line was long, passengers impatient, voices sharp as boarding was announced. Near the counter, a commotion was brewing. A nervous young woman whispered to her husband, pointing at the cockpit window where the pilot could be faintly seen. Soon murmurs spread. "Have you heard? They say one of the pilots is sick," a man muttered. "Are you serious?" "Then who's flying?" another passenger demanded, anxiety already climbing. The news traveled like wildfire through the waiting area. The co-pilot had fallen ill suddenly before boarding, and the airline was scrambling to make arrangements. People panicked, their confidence cracking as fear and prejudice began to surface. That's when David felt the first eyes turn toward him. He had made the mistake, or perhaps the deliberate choice, of wearing his old aviation pin on his jacket that day. Someone noticed it, then another, until whispers rose. "Isn't he a pilot? He's black. Would you trust him with your life up there?" The words stung, not because David hadn't heard them before, but because they were spoken so carelessly, in the middle of a crisis where lives could depend on skill, not skin color. He ignored them, quietly stepping aside, as the crew made hurried announcements about a slight delay. Inside the plane, eventually, boarding began. Passengers shuffled into the aircraft, grumbling, suspicious, their nerves stretched thin. David found his seat near the middle of the cabin, placing his bag neatly under the chair before settling in. Around him, the atmosphere was tense. An elderly woman clutched her rosary beads. A businessman tapped furiously at his phone, muttering about delays costing him money. Two children squabbled over the window seat until their exhausted mother snapped at them. David noticed it all, the way a trained pilot does. Every detail, every sound, every vibration. It wasn't habit. It was instinct. He had spent his life being responsible for hundreds of souls at once, and even now, sitting as a passenger, he couldn't turn it off. When the captain finally spoke over the intercom, the voice was steady, but strained.
He explained that due to the co-pilot's sudden illness, they would be operating short-staffed, with assistance from a substitute in training.
Murmurs spread again. People glanced nervously toward the cockpit, their fears mounting, and then came turbulence, unexpected, sharp, shaking the plane moments after takeoff. Gasps filled the cabin. A few screamed. The aircraft steadied, but the unease lingered, prejudice in the airs. The flight continued. David caught fragments of conversation from those seated nearby. A man in a pressed white shirt leaned across the aisle. "They should have just canceled the flight. You can't risk lives like this." Another replied. "They said that black guy at the gate was a pilot. Can you imagine if they asked him? No way. Not with all our lives on the line." The words were venom dressed as concern. David remained calm, though inside a storm brewed. He had flown through typhoons, navigated systems failures, handled emergencies that could have killed him and hundreds on board. And yet, to these strangers, his competence was invisible, erased by the color of his skin, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence could sometimes be more powerful than argument. The calm. Before the storm hours into the flight, the cabin had settled. The seatbelt sign was off. The attendants moved quietly with carts of drinks, and nervous passengers tried to distract themselves with magazines or sleep. David closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the engines, the subtle shifts of air pressure. He could almost sense when something was off. And then, something was. A sudden jolt rattled the plane. Lights flickered overhead. The engines roared unevenly, one louder than the other. A shriek rose from the back rows, followed by cries of panic. The plane lurched violently to the left, oxygen masks dropping from the ceiling in a cascade of yellow. The captain's voice broke through the chaos, urgent now, stripped of calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated." His words were cut short by static. The cabin dissolved into screams. Parents clutched their children. Strangers prayed aloud. Flight attendants struggled to keep order. It was chaos in its purest form. Fear unleashed at 30,000 feet, and there sat David Carter, a man dismissed, doubted, whispered about, calmly unbuckling his belt. Because while everyone else saw death, he saw procedure. While they panicked, he remembered training. And while they doubted him, the truth was this: he was the only person on that plane who knew exactly what to do. The cabin shook again, harsher this time, as if the sky itself had turned hostile. Drinks toppled, trays slid to the floor, and a child's cry pierced through the roar of the engines. The oxygen masks dangled uselessly, swinging in wild arcs. Passengers screamed, their fear palpable, clawing at one another in desperation. The attendants tried to calm them, their rehearsed reassurances breaking apart under the weight of chaos. David Carter's jaw tightened. His instincts screamed at him that this wasn't normal turbulence. Something was deeply wrong. He glanced out the window. Far in the distance, he saw dark clouds swallowing the horizon, lightning slicing through the sky. The aircraft had flown straight into a brewing storm. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice cracked through the speakers, strained and uncertain. "We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated and calm." The announcement did little to help. People clutched their armrests, eyes wide with terror. The businessman across from David barked at a flight attendant, his voice sharp with anger and fear. "Tell us the truth. What's happening? Are we going down?" The attendant swallowed hard, unable to answer. That silence said more than words ever could. The decision David closed his eyes for a brief second, steadying himself. He had promised his family he wouldn't get involved on flights like these, not when he was off duty. But this wasn't about promises anymore. This was about survival. He stood, his tall frame rising above the chaos, and began moving toward the front of the plane. A man grabbed his sleeve. "Where are you going?" the stranger demanded, his tone thick with accusation. "To help," David answered simply, his voice calm, steady. "Help? What can you do? You're not crew." David didn't reply. He just kept walking, but whispers followed him down the aisle. "Is that him?" The black pilot. "You can't be serious. They'd let him in the cockpit?" Suspicion thickened the air, but David ignored it all. His focus was on the narrow door ahead, the one separating the terrified passengers from the desperate crew. Confrontation at the cockpit 2 attendants blocked the cockpit door, their faces pale. One held her arms out.
"Sir, please return to your seat."
"We need everyone calm." "I can't," David said firmly. "I'm a captain, certified with over 12,000 hours of flight time. If you don't let me in, you're risking every life on this plane." The attendants froze. One stammered, We can't just..." The cockpit door cracked open slightly then, and the captain himself appeared. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his uniform rumpled, eyes bloodshot from strain. He looked at David, suspicion flickering in his gaze. "You're a pilot?" "Yes, David Carter. United Delta, and now commercial freight. 20 years experience. I'm type-rated for this aircraft model. If you don't let me in, you won't make it through this storm alive." For a long, tense second, The captain searched David's face. Behind them, a man shouted, "Don't trust him! This is madness!" Another voice added, "We don't even know if he's telling the truth." The weight of prejudice hung in the air, but then another violent lurch slammed the aircraft, throwing several people from their seats. The captain made his decision. He pulled the door wider. "Get in." David stepped into the cramped space. The substitute first officer, a young trainee, was pale and trembling, his hands gripping the yoke too tightly. Warning alarms blared across the panel. One engine had failed. The other sputtered under strain. "Status?" David asked sharply. The captain rattled it off. "Right engine flame out. Left unstable. Autopilot disengaged. We're in a crosswind heading directly into storm activity." David's mind calculated instantly. Thousands of training hours, years of experience, muscle memory kicking in. He slid into the first officer's seat. "Let's stabilize first. Nose up 3 degrees. Reduce speed by 20 knots. The captain hesitated, then obeyed. Gradually, the violent rocking lessened. Not safe, not steady, but survivable. The young trainee exhaled shakily. David glanced at him. "You did your best. Now watch and learn." Back in the cabin, news traveled fast. The passengers soon realized the black man, the one they whispered about, was in the cockpit now. Panic shifted into something uglier, doubt laced with prejudice. "He's flying the plane?" The businessman shouted. "This is insane," another cried. "We'll crash for sure." A woman's voice cut through the noise. The elderly lady with the rosary beads stood, her voice shaking but strong. "You all doubted him before. But he's the only one who walked up there when everyone else stayed crying in their seats. Maybe show some faith." The cabin quieted, her words sinking in like a reprimand from a grandmother. But unease still lingered. People weren't ready to trust him. Not yet. The storm inside. The cockpit, lightning split the sky in jagged flashes, illuminating clouds like monstrous waves. Rain battered the windshield, the aircraft groaning under pressure. David's voice remained steady, commanding, as he worked the controls. "Adjust heading 240. Diverting to nearest alternate airport." The captain nodded. "Fuel status?" "Barely enough for diversion." Another alarm shrieked. The left engine sputtered again, threatening to die. "Come on, baby," David muttered under his breath, coaxing the machine as if it were alive. "Hold it together." The plane bucked violently. David's hands moved with precision, countering every dip and lurch, balancing a crippled aircraft through one of the worst storms he'd ever seen. The captain glanced at him, awe slowly replacing doubt. For the first time that night, his voice softened. "You've done this before." "More times than I can count," David replied. His eyes never left the instruments. The turning point back in the cabin, the attendants moved among passengers checking belts, reassuring children. But every so often, fearful eyes flicked toward the cockpit door. Doubt still lingered. Then suddenly, the PA crackled to life. David's calm, commanding voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Carter speaking. We've experienced multiple engine failures due to storm conditions, but I want you to hear this directly from me. I've flown through worse.
I know this aircraft.
And I promise you, we are not going down tonight. I need your trust and I need your calm. We're going to make it." His words carried weight, firm, unshakable, infused with authority. The cabin hushed. For the first time, fear gave way to fragile hope. Even the businessman who had doubted him lowered his eyes, shame creeping across his face. Climax. Approaching. But the storm wasn't finished. Another lightning strike rattled the fuselage. The last engine sputtered violently, threatening to cut out altogether. Inside the cockpit, alarms wailed, red lights flashing like angry warnings. David's hands gripped the yoke, his mind racing through every contingency. "Captain," the trainee whispered, voice trembling. "Can we really make it?" David turned to him, his expression firm. "Flying isn't about perfect conditions. It's about finding a way through the impossible. And we will." His voice was iron, unbreakable. The storm raged on, but so did he, and for the first time every soul on board began to believe. The storm outside was no longer a backdrop. It was a beast, swallowing the sky whole. Thunder cracked so loudly it rattled the very bones of the aircraft. lightning illuminating the cabin in violent, white flashes. The passengers sat frozen, gripped by the kind of silence that only true fear can create. Every bump, every lurch was met with gasps and clutched armrests. Inside the cockpit, the chaos was louder still. Red warning lights flashed across the panels like angry eyes, alarms shrieking a chorus of impending doom. The right engine had already failed, and the left, weak, sputtering, coughed like an exhausted runner on their last breath. David Carter's hands gripped the yoke, sweat trickling down his temples, though his face remained a mask of determination. He had seen storms before. He had flown through mechanical failures, but never had he faced both at once in a passenger jet filled with hundreds of lives counting on him. The captain beside him whispered, almost as if praying, "If this engine dies, we won't make it." David's voice was steady, iron. "Then we don't let it die. The final failure." But fate had other plans. With a sudden jolt, the last engine gave a loud, choking sputter and fell silent. The sound was terrifying in its absence. No more roar of turbines, just the whistling rush of air as the massive jet became nothing more than a glider, slicing helplessly through the storm. The young trainee's eyes widened, his hands trembling. "We've lost it. Both engines are gone." In the cabin, passengers screamed. The businessman, who had doubted David from the start, clutched his chest as though the plane had already hit the ground. Mothers wept. Children buried their faces in their parents' shoulders. The elderly woman with the rosary beads began praying aloud, her trembling voice carrying through the cabin like a desperate hymn. David's calm, but in the cockpit, David did not flinch. His mind became a steel trap, calculating possibilities. Altitude, 28,000 feet. Glide ratio, enough to keep them airborne, but not enough to drift aimlessly. They needed a runway, and they needed it fast. He spoke quickly, efficiently. "Nearest runway?" The captain fumbled with the navigation system. "Lahore, 20 miles out. Too far without power." "Not if we manage the glide perfectly," David countered. "We cut drag, pitched down just enough to extend the glide." "We can make it." The trainee looked at him in disbelief. "But in this storm," David cut him off. "Storm or no storm, these people need us to fly. Now focus." He gripped the yoke, his movements precise, coaxing the massive steel bird into its silent descent. It was no longer about engines, it was about control, instinct, and unshakable will. The battle with the storm lightning struck again, so close it blinded them for a split second. The plane jolted violently, wind tearing at it like claws. Rain lashed the windshield, blurring visibility. The captain muttered, "We'll never see the runway in this mess." David narrowed his eyes. "We don't need to see it yet. We just need to reach it." The instruments flickered, overloaded by the storm's electric fury. For a terrifying second, the cockpit went dark. Only the emergency lights glowed faintly, painting David's face in eerie red. The passengers screamed again, convinced the end had come. In the darkness, the businessman shouted, "This is your fault! You let him fly us to our deaths!" But the elderly woman answered sharply, her voice rising above the panic. "No, he is the only reason we are still in the air." Her conviction silenced the cabin. For the first time, faith outweighed fear. The impossible glide David leaned forward, speaking calmly to the captain. "Set flaps to reduce descent rate. Keep us aligned on heading 240. We'll ride the glide as far as we can." The captain obeyed without question now. Doubt had melted into trust. He knew, deep down, that without David, they'd already be nothing more than wreckage scattered in a field. Minutes stretched like hours. The plane groaned as it cut through the storm, powerless but not defeated. David's hands were steady, his voice calm as he guided the crippled aircraft through the tempest. At last, through the sheets of rain, a faint glow appeared ahead, the scattered lights of Lahore's runway, flickering through the storm like a beacon of salvation. "There," the trainee shouted. "Runway in sight." The final test, but the storm had one last cruelty to deliver. A savage gust of crosswind slammed into the aircraft, shoving it violently off course. The runway lights slipped sideways in the windshield, the plane tilting dangerously. Alarms wailed again. "Stall warning! Stall warning!" The captain gasped, "We're losing control!" David's voice thundered over the chaos. "Not today!" He fought the yoke with every ounce of strength, pulling the massive machine back online. His muscles burned, sweat poured, but his focus never wavered. Inch by inch, he wrestled the aircraft back toward the runway. The ground rushed closer. 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000, too fast, too steep. Flaps full, David barked. Flaps full, the captain confirmed. The plane leveled slightly, but the speed was still deadly. We're not going to stop in time, the trainee cried. David's eyes blazed with unyielding determination. Then we make the stop. Brace. The landing. The runway loomed larger, closer, the wet tarmac gleaming under the storm's fury. The passengers held their breath, some praying, others whispering silent apologies to loved ones. Then, with a bone-rattling crash, the aircraft's wheels slammed onto the runway. Sparks flew as the landing gear screamed under the weight. The plane skidded violently across the slick surface, hydroplaning, fighting against momentum. Reverse thrust. Oh, wait. The captain shouted, panic flashing. Without engines, there was no reverse thrust. Manual brakes, David roared, slamming his foot onto the pedals. The aircraft screamed, sliding, skidding. The runway lights blurred past in a dizzying streak. Passengers clutched each other, certain the end was seconds away. The plane tore down the runway, its brakes groaning, tires burning against wet asphalt. The smell of smoke filled the cabin. 1,000 feet left. 500. 300, finally. With one last shuddering screech, the massive aircraft ground to a halt. Half the tires were shredded, the brakes scorched, but the plane had stopped. Silence fell. Aftermath in the cabin for a long, breathless moment. No one moved. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was only stunned silence. Then, slowly, applause broke out. First a few hesitant claps, then a chorus, then a thunderous standing ovation. Tears streamed down faces. Strangers embraced. Mothers kissed their children's foreheads. The businessman who had doubted David sat with his face in his hands, ashamed. He finally looked up, his eyes wet, and whispered, "I was wrong." The elderly woman with the rosary beads smiled faintly, whispering a prayer of gratitude. David's quiet victory inside the cockpit. David leaned back in his seat, exhausted but steady. His hands, still gripping the yoke, finally loosened. The captain turned to him, awe etched across his features. "You just pulled off the impossible," David shook his head. "Not impossible, just necessary." He stood, stepping out into the cabin. Every eye turned to him, every doubt silenced. The passengers, once skeptical, now looked at him as their savior. But David didn't bask in the glory. He simply nodded once, quietly, humbly. He knew he hadn't just saved lives, he had silenced prejudice. If only for one unforgettable night. The storm outside raged on, thunder echoing across the runway as if nature itself was unwilling to let go of its grip. Yet inside the aircraft, silence ruled, thick, heavy, and almost sacred. The plane, crippled and scarred from the ordeal, sat still at the edge of the runway. For those who had been inside, it wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a coffin they had feared, a miracle they had lived. And in the center of it all stood David Carter. The moment after, he remained calm, though exhaustion etched itself into his very bones. His uniform was soaked with sweat, his hands still trembling from the raw force he had wrestled into obedience. For him, it was not about applause or recognition. It was about breath, the breath of every child, every mother, every soul on board that was still alive because he refused to let go. The cabin crew unbuckled themselves and rushed down the aisles, checking passengers, soothing nerves. The cries of children softened, replaced by the stunned hush of adults who had stared death in the face and lived to tell of it. Then, like a wave breaking against a shore, the silence cracked. Applause. It started with one clap from the elderly woman clutching her rosary beads. Then another from the teenager who had earlier laughed at David's steady seriousness. Soon the cabin roared, not with fear this time, but gratitude. People stood, crying, clapping, shouting words that the storm outside drowned, but which David didn't need to hear. He bowed his head, a quiet acknowledgement, before retreating back to the cockpit. The passenger who doubted as the applause swelled. One man could not join in immediately, the businessman who had hurled insults and blame. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his arrogance stripped bare. Shame burned in his chest as he remembered every word he had spoken against David. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaky, and made his way down the aisle. The passengers parted, watching him with curiosity, some even with disdain. He stopped just short of David, who was standing by the cockpit door, speaking quietly with the captain. The man's voice cracked, a whisper at first. "I was wrong." David looked at him, his gaze steady and unreadable. For a long, painful second, the man feared rejection, that David would ignore him, as he had ignored David's dignity earlier. But instead, David placed a hand on his shoulder. "We both learned something tonight." The businessman swallowed hard, nodding. In that moment, he understood something deeper than survival: respect. The world outside. When the passengers were finally escorted out onto the wet tarmac, emergency lights flashing around them, the full gravity of what they had survived hit them. News cameras had already gathered, tipped off by emergency signals of a mayday in the skies. Journalists rushed forward, capturing shaky survivors clutching each other, sobbing, or looking upward in stunned disbelief. And then came the image that would circle the globe. David stepping down from the aircraft last, his face solemn, his posture strong, the storm rain drenching him like baptism. The admiring glances, the flash of cameras, the whispers of, "That's him. The one who saved us." The headlines were instant. "Black pilot saves hundreds in mid-air miracle. Hero at 30,000 feet. Flight disaster narrowly avoided. Prejudice silenced as courage soars." The world, always hungry for a story, had found one. But this story was different. It wasn't just about survival. It was about what had nearly destroyed them before the storm even touched the plane. Doubt. Dismissal and prejudice, the recognition within days. David was no longer just a name. He was a symbol. The airline held a press conference, where executives who had once quietly debated whether someone like him could truly represent their brand now stood in front of cameras praising his quick thinking, his unparalleled professionalism, and his unwavering bravery. But David didn't attend for their words. He came for the people. Survivors of the flight sat in the audience, holding flowers, some with children who clung to their arms. When David stepped on stage, they rose to their feet again, giving him the kind of ovation that felt less like applause and more like worship. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. Instead, he simply said, "I am a pilot. I do not fly with color. I do not fly with bias. I fly with responsibility. Every life on board matters equally. That's what it means to be trusted with wings." The words rippled outward, carried by newspapers, television, and the internet. They weren't grandiose. They weren't rehearsed. But they cut deep, because they were true. The lives changed each. Passenger carried the memory of that night differently. The elderly woman told her grandchildren the story of the angel who flew through the storm. The businessman became one of the loudest advocates for diversity in his industry, ashamed of his blindness. The young trainee pilot who had once trembled in the cockpit trained harder than ever, determined to one day carry himself with the same steadiness. For them, the story wasn't just survival, it was transformation. David's reflection, and what of David? He didn't bask in his fame. He didn't let the newspapers crown him a hero. He returned quietly to his routine, flying again within weeks. For him, the sky was not a stage for glory. It was a responsibility. Yet in quiet moments, when he walked through airports, he noticed the difference. Strangers nodded at him with respect. Children pointed, whispering excitedly to their parents. Other black pilots, flight attendants, and crew members came up to him, thanking him, not just for saving lives, but for breaking barriers, for showing the world what they already knew. In his heart, he carried scars too, not visible like the storm-torn aircraft, but etched by years of being underestimated. Yet now those scars had meaning. They were proof that resilience, not prejudice, defines greatness. The lasting impact months later, during a ceremony in Washington, David received a medal for his actions. As cameras flashed and officials spoke of extraordinary heroism, David thought only of the night sky, the lightning tearing it open, and the silence in the cabin as the engines failed. He thought of the faces, the fear, the doubt, the hope, He thought of how easily things could have gone differently. And when asked what he wanted the world to take from his story, he simply said, "Trust should not be earned by the color of a man's skin, but by the strength of his character. If my actions proved anything, let it be that truth." Closing image. The story ends not in thunder or applause, but in something quieter. A simple image of David, years later, walking down a runway at sunset, his silhouette framed against the fading light. His uniform neat, his stride steady, his gaze lifted toward the horizon. Behind him lies the storm he conquered. Ahead of him lies the endless sky, and somewhere in the hearts of all who doubted, silence remains. The silence of respect earned and prejudice defeated.